Welcome back to organizational conflict resolution. Now, I had mentioned a few weeks back that I have a great deal of practical experience working with potential violence, escalating, angry, potentially violent conflict, and actual violence, actually, given my career path. And I have had many students who share this life experience. Several are in law enforcement, some work in probation, others parole, work as prison guards, work in juvenile treatment centers, work in schools. And so what I would like to do in the last weeks of our time together is share some of my real-world experience and focus on giving you field-tested experience. For example, some of what you study in NCRP is exactly what hostage negotiators do in successful hostage negotiations, but my focus will be on preventing, diffusing, managing organizational violence. Okay, let me turn to the PowerPoint that I prepared for you this week. This is also going to be, a PowerPoint on leading change, because you cannot prevent violence in troubled, dysfunctional organizations unless you're able to find a way with organizational leadership and stakeholders to lead change. I mean, unless you're putting your head in the sand, which unfortunately several potentially violent schools that I've worked with have been, you have to be prepared to recognize the signs, the truth, the realities of what's going on, and address them. Now, astute process observation and people observation is critical. Now, one of your classmates last semester was stating her understanding of the Myers-Briggs, that the N for intuition is all about noticing the big picture and patterns rather, noticing the forest rather than the trees, while the S, the sensates of the world, are very attentive to all the trees, all the details of daily life. I would say, in my experience, as someone who has worked with very troubled organizations, we just need to be strong enough and aware enough to notice what's going on. Too often I have walked into, and I was teaching at the University of Denver and Metropolitan State University when the Columbine tragedy happened in Colorado. Too often I walk into schools where I can hear, taste, and see the violence brewing, and inevitably I would meet an administrator who would say, oh, we have no problems here. And they would not have a clue what was going on with the students. And if we're outside consultants, we often have fresh eyes and are able to give that outsider perspective. But we need to find ways, particularly if we're inside, to help others come out of denial, minimizing what's going on, whatever it is that's fueling not noticing the actual organizational realities. Trustworthy information gathering is critical. Now, when I taught the managing the angry and violent client in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver, and the managing violence and crisis for organizations in applied communications, you wouldn't believe, or maybe you would based on your organizational experience, how many organizations will put up, anonymous complaint boxes and then never read what is put into those boxes. They really don't care. It's a surface pseudo gesture, and they're not taking their constituency seriously. Maybe they don't even want to know. They're conflict avoiders who are putting their heads in the sand. We have to find a way to counter this in order to help troubled organizations. And what I had mentioned earlier, somehow we need to see what others aren't. And we need to break through and help organizations break through denial and positive spin. You know, rose-colored glasses, pink clouds. It's not easy work. It needs to be done very delicately, very strategically, very skillfully. Now, sometimes systems are entrenched in corruption. I mean, Southern California has a lot of organizations. You've seen, those of you living here, the variety of public scandals that we have with organizational corruption and power abuse. And the people who are within that system have learned to look the other way, say it's not my, it's not my job. The whole Enron scandal, many of the lower level employees would say, you're not paying me enough to be a whistleblower. I'm just going to keep my head down and do my job and hope I keep my job. And we have to, I mean, you can't help a conflicted, troubled organization with anything unless you can somehow find a way to break through this. And your fresh eyes, if you're an outsider, is critical. But also, as I explained in an earlier lecture, finding people, organizational stakeholders who are willing to work with you, collaborate, to slowly but surely do what is needed. You need to do, as I will be reviewing, some very strong systemic force field analysis. So this is strategic. Yeah, I once had an administrator in Boulder, Colorado, which is an incredibly beautiful part of the United States, right, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. An administrator of a nonprofit, very successful, very committed to the community. But I asked her, why the school administrators I was meeting weren't acknowledging the problems in their school, the conflict, the bullying, all of it. And this is what she said to me. We only see beauty here. We ignore everything else. Now, I've already talked in a past lecture about how groupthink can be deadly, and actually, it's in the shuttle case study that led to the theory of groupthink, it was literally deadly. Everybody agreeing with the leader of an organization, looking the other way, not being willing to say the emperor is wearing no clothes, just like a highly dysfunctional family that can be the breeding ground for the most horrific violence that we are seeing. And I'll tell you, the Columbine crisis was not like some of the other crises that we've seen since. Now, the recent Las Vegas shooting and crisis, from all that investigators are learning, nobody had any clue or any sign of what this person was doing. Now, I have a hard time believing that, given his arsenal of guns, his close, intimate relationships with family. We'll learn more, I think, as time goes on. But I will tell you, Columbine law enforcement did have signs. They had warning signs, but they just poo-pooed, discounted that these were bullied, alienated boys, and kids will be kids, and they didn't respond the way, in hindsight, in regret and looking back, they wish they had responded, because the Columbine crisis took years to build and finally manifest. Now, I've talked already about the fact insiders are not always trustworthy. Even if they declare themselves as impartial, too often they are loyal first to their organization and to keeping their jobs. So this is an assessment that we have to do. And maybe, there's an insider who has potential to be trustworthy with some ethics training, with some support. These are some of the things we need to examine. But we, as NCRP practitioners who are hoping to prevent violence and help an organization become healthier, must be committed to sincere truth-seeking wherever it leads us. So we must be training ourselves to notice what others are denying, ignoring, and discounting. We must be independent of any kind of groupthink. And if this is your own organization, this can be very tricky. Now, when you interview organizational members, this is one of the things that's recommended, and too often, human resources, managers, others doing interviewing and hiring never ask about, how a person approaches conflict, their views regarding violence. Once you start asking people about these topics, you would be shocked how often someone with a history of violent behavior is quite proud of their history, will brag about their history. I mean, you start to gather critical information that can help the organization do what it needs to do. Now, there is so much that can be done within organizations to prevent violence. We don't just need to wait for the peak crisis and go into lockdown. This drives me a little crazy. I have a very full life with all of you and my international work, my research and scholarship, so I'm not doing that much organizational consulting, but I'm wondering, why aren't organizations learning all the other systemic things that they can do to prevent violence, to prevent this crisis? There's so many people who are becoming experts on all of this. And one of the things that I would teach my students is, if someone comes in who is threatening, who is acting crazy, and I don't mean that literally, but who is, sending off sparks and warning signs, there are ways to alert the other members of the organization, so you can develop systems to protect yourself. That's just one example. Now, I very much believe when organizations can have collaborative problem solving, where all organizational stakeholders identify the problems that they are facing, without any, risk of retaliation for being honest and naming the problem. When they can do it in a safe space and safe ways, then organizational stakeholders can come together and problem solve, decide on their organizational boundaries and approaches. Instead, I see all these visioning retreats, all these branding retreats. I'm like, what world are you living in? Yes, it's important to have a vision, and it's important, to sell your organization. But first and foremost on Maslow's hierarchy of needs is providing a safe space where truth is acknowledged and resolving that conflict problem is a priority. Now, if you have skilled NCRP facilitators and organizational stakeholders who are educated in the best of NCRP skills, this can be done over a period of time. Various departments can do it separately and then all come together in a large organizational gathering. I think the most important thing, though, in a dysfunctional, conflicted organization is that most people feel unsafe, and that needs to be addressed. Now, systems analysis for change is a tool that needs to be used, and I think most of you have been introduced to Kurt Lewin's force field analysis and theories of conflict. I know I stress him in holding these truths. You have to be savvy about how you're going about organizational change. And so you're asking, okay, what is the priority? What is the goal? What is the aspiration? And I'm going to review force field analysis with you. You then ask, what organizational forces are supporting your goal, aspiration, plan for change? Maybe your plan to prevent violence. And how can you empower those forces? So what's on your side? And then, just as important, who are, maybe more important, who are your organizational power allies? Now, as you see in Holding These Truths, as a lawyer, former litigator, I work a lot with lawyers and I work with rule of law. There is a lot of power there's a reason organizations, particularly corporations, international agencies, have legal departments. And I would say everyone, and unions as well, have their lawyers. It's because they're power allies, and they make the difference in preventing violence, ensuring organizational justice, responsiveness to genuine injustice, need. They need to be people you're working with. But you might be able to work with human resources. Often, human resources is educated in the law. Sometimes lawyers are hired to be in those positions. What's most important is that you identify or bring in organizational power allies. Now, the flip side of what's supporting your aspiration, your goal, is what organizational elements are against you. What kind of resistance are you facing? How can you reduce? How can you work with this? I would say this kind of thorough, in-depth information gathering and reflection is critical to catalyzing organizational justice against all odds. At least it's my approach. Okay, enough. Some of my real-world experience to help you all with preventing violence, facilitating organizational change. I will be coming back in the last weeks of class to specifically talk about diffusing, de-escalating potential violence, because I really don't want to see more of the tragedies that we have seen in the United States and around the world, several European nations while I was visiting 2 years ago. And one thing I would like to conclude with today, because you're hearing mental illness blamed for a lot of the violence. And the research that I have studied does not place mental illness as one of the most important indicators of potential violence. Instead, it lists learned violent behavior as the #1 most important indicator, that somebody has a history of violence in their childhood, in their community, of actual violent behavior. And the other variables that are linked with that, military service, sadly, it's true, post-traumatic stress disorder and violence can go together. A love of weapons and easy access to weapons. And then also, you can see the lethal combination in the United States today. Alcohol and addiction, use of certain drugs. Certain drugs are more linked with violent behavior than others. Those are the most important variables that organizations need to screen and be aware of as they're trying to prevent violence. Okay, look forward to seeing you soon. Have a wonderful week.